Kia ora koutou. It's now 2 o'clock, so we'll get started and as others continue to join us. First of all, welcome and thank you for joining this open Zoom on emissions pricing, forests and a path to net zero. My name's Sam King and I'm the manager of the Land and Waste team here at the Climate Change Commission. My role today is to facilitate the question and answer. I'll explain how the session's going to run in a minute, but first I'd like to invite Bevan Hunter to say an opening karakia.
Ngā mihi nui kia koutou I runga I te pauka whakata reo nei, anei te karakia timatanga. Paua ki runga, paua ki raro, ruia, tuia, kōkiritia, kia mau, kia au, kia ora ai. He pikinga ki te rangi, kia tū I taio, he pau e hora, he pau a rangi, kia hora a papa, haumi e hui e.
Tai kia.
So, this karakia is an expression of action relevant to our kōrero today. It speaks to our organisational name, He Paua Rangi, which communicates the sacred bond between Rangi Nui, the sky, and Papa Tuanuku, the earth. And it speaks to restoring balance from human transgressions. As humans, it's our duty to restore that balance. Or in te reo, that's whakautu. It's a reminder that the environment is our superior, our tuakana or tuahine. Paua is a metaphorical post, a gathering of people to support a cause, and it's also putting a stake in the ground. Ruia means to sow or cast away, discard. So it's a reminder to plant what's needed, take what's needed, and leave that which is not needed. Tuia means to lash or walk arm in arm. Kōkiritia, to champion a cause, which is what we're doing at the moment. And hora, to make public or display, which is also relevant to our kōrero today and what we are doing. So kia ora, Sam, I'll hand that back to you.
Thank you very much, Bevan. So I'll explain how today's going to run. You're going to hear from some of our principal analysts and there'll be an opportunity to have your questions answered. In terms of some housekeeping, can you please, if you're comfortable, state your name and organisation in the chat section? We'd love to see who's joining us today. If you've got a question, please use the Q&A button and feel free to ask it at any time and we'll pick it up at the end. We'll try to get to every question, but if we don't have time to get to yours, please feel free to email us at hello@climatecommission.gov.nz. Just a quick reminder, we are recording this session and it will be made available on the Commission's website afterwards. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Chris.
So kia ora everybody. So I'm Chris Holland, I'm a Principal Analyst here at the Commission. I'm going to start today by giving a bit of an overview of what we'll cover. And then I will start to take us through some of the material from the chapters in the report. So today we want to cover, I'll start by giving a brief reminder about the Commission's role and remit and a bit of context around the piece of advice that we're giving at the moment and the consultation that we're undertaking. I'll then talk through the section of our advice which deals with setting out a path to net zero emissions. Then my colleague Eva will talk us through the advice related to emissions pricing, and then Ben will talk us through the chapter related to forestry. After that, I can explain a little bit more about consultation and how to make a submission. And then, as Sam mentioned, we'd really like to allow lots of time to answer your questions. So as questions occur to you through our presentations, please use the Q&A button to post your questions, which we will try and answer. So moving on to the Commission's role. So very briefly, the Commission was created in 2019 with the amendments to the Climate Change Response Act. Our roles under the Act are varied and the factors we must consider are detailed and specific. Some of the core considerations we have to have regard to when we give our advice are things like giving effect to the Crown-Maori relationship, Te Ao Māori, and the specific effects on iwi and Māori in all the advice we give. We need to think about the distribution of effects, including between generations. We need to think about the economic impact of the advice that we give and the social, cultural and environmental circumstances which the government is providing is making decisions around climate change policy. We're an independent Crown entity with an advisory role within the wider system of climate change policy in Aotearoa. The conclusions and recommendations are made by a board of commissioners and are informed by science, evidence and analysis carried out by the commission staff. Importantly, our advice is informed and tested through input through public consultations and engagement with stakeholders. Turning to this piece of advice, so while today we're focused on advice for the second emissions reduction plan, we've got a wide range of advice under development at the moment. From 2024, the Commission will provide annual reports to assess the progress towards meeting emissions budgets, and that will be the first opportunity to assess the National Adaptation Plan. In 2024, the Commission will also report on its review of the 2050 target and advise on the level of emissions budget 4, which covers the period 2035 to 2040. And we'll also be reviewing whether emissions from international aviation and shipping should be included in the 2050 target. So for those three pieces of advice which we're giving in 2024, there's a call for evidence open for on our website, looking for evidence which could support our assessment of those pieces of work. Last week, we launched our consultation on our draft advice to government on the direction of policy actions in the second budget period. Consultation is a chance for us to share our thinking and for people to submit what they've said on what we've said in our draft advice. Once we've incorporated what we've heard, our final advice is due to ministers by the end of the year. So thinking about what's different in this advice. So the second emissions budget for the years 2026 to 2030 has already been set, and now government needs to set out its plan to deliver on it. Because the government now has its first emissions reduction plan in place, this draft advice is focused on building the work already progressing for the first emissions budget period. Our work includes identifying where there are critical gaps and where existing actions might need to be strengthened and accelerated to achieve the second emissions budget period and to achieve the 2050 target. Reflecting that there's already much climate action underway, the Commission's draft advice has fewer recommendations than when we gave our advice in 2021. We received feedback on that first advice that fewer recommendations would be more helpful. We've also looked at how emissions pricing is likely to drive change. For each sector and across the broader system, we've identified where barriers currently deter action and where strategic investments can help drive deeper change over the long term. We've also gathered and analysed data and evidence from a wide range of credible sources and reviewed a broad range of literature to support this draft advice. We've used both quantitative and qualitative tools to guide our analysis and tested the quality of our evidence, refining it along the way. Thinking about consultation, we are consulting on our draft advice to government on the direction of policy. It's the role of the government of the day to decide on the specific policy choices to give effect to the emissions reduction plan. It's important that our advice reflects what the people of Aotearoa New Zealand are experiencing and care about. Having input is vitally important for us. We want to know what you think of our draft recommendations and what you think is the correct path we should be taking in the second budget period. We look forward to receiving your submissions. At the end, I'll cover how you can make a submission, and there's more information available on our website. So moving on to the advice that we gave last week and what we said in chapter 3 of that advice. So Aotearoa has a target to reach net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases except biogenic methane by 2050, and to stay at net zero beyond this. So those gases are predominantly long-lived gases of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. So by 2050, that means that any remaining emissions have to be balanced out by removals, carbon removals from forestry to achieve net zero. The structure of the target doesn't specify any limit on the amount of carbon removals from forestry that are allowed to achieve net zero. So at an extreme, net zero could be achieved by increasing removals from forests and not through any reductions in emissions. So the choice Aotearoa has today is how far to reduce gross emissions in meeting net zero. This is important for the Commission to think about because the Act requires us to consider the risks and uncertainties associated with emissions reductions and removals, the impact of those actions, and what that means for our ability to adapt to climate change. We also need to consider the distribution of those impacts across regions and communities of Aotearoa and between generations. And so we've thought about that in giving our advice. We showed in our previous advice that reducing gross emissions and transitioning to a low emissions economy could provide significant benefits. These include leading to healthier homes and buildings, encouraging new ways of moving around, and opening up new market opportunities. Forests, though, will be critical in reaching the 2050 target and budgets, and can provide wider benefits such as enhancing biodiversity, better air and water quality, and stabilisation of land to manage erosion. But while the 2050 target or conventional emissions accounting distinguish between gross emissions reductions and removals, they're not directly equivalent. This is because, as we kind of can see in this diagram on the right of the screen, extracting fossil fuels and burning them adds to the amount of carbon in the active carbon cycle. To balance out those emissions, the carbon must be stored in forests in perpetuity. If those forests are destroyed, or if they are not replanted after being harvested, then the carbon could be released back into the air. Things like pests, diseases, and fires, or strong wind events, could damage and destroy forests. Forestry also locks in land use, and there's a limit to how much carbon can be absorbed and stored. This raises equity concerns, particularly thinking about future generations. And if we delay action on gross emissions, this risks continuing to build emissions-intensive infrastructure, and means we'll also miss out on those benefits that I talked about earlier. So the issue that we've observed at the moment is that the target alone does not provide enough direction and certainty on what mix of emissions reductions and removals are intended. When we recommended our budgets that would help meet the 2050 target, we recommended a path which entailed deep cuts to gross emissions as the best way to achieve the 2050 target, considering all those factors in the Act. The government has indicated that it agrees in part with the levels of emissions reductions and removals which we set out. However, without firmer commitment to what level of emissions reductions should be, it's difficult for the government to show that its policies are aligned with meeting that outcome. So moving on to our recommendations, that's why we've proposed two recommendations in this space. First is for the government to commit to a specific level of gross emissions reductions for the second and third emissions budgets. So those should be no less ambitious than 362 megatons in the second budget period and 322 megatons in the third budget. And that's to ensure that its policy choices align with delivering that outcome. So those figures of 362 and 322 megatons are derived from totaling up the sector sub-targets which the government set out in the first emissions reduction plan, and that it's indicated it will use to manage to meet progress towards meeting the budgets. And we also feel it's helpful for the government to provide an indication of the gross emissions and removals it's expecting to see by 2050 to also guide policy development. So to summarise, we're proposing an approach in which both forest and gross emissions reductions contribute. We're proposing this to help set the direction of policy, and so that we understand the outcomes that the government is trying to achieve. We recommend it's for the government to set out what policy mix is used to achieve those outcomes. So overall, we're suggesting that we need to balance both emissions reductions and removals in achieving 2050. So those are our proposed recommendations relating to setting out a path to net zero emissions. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Eva to discuss our draft advice on emissions pricing.
Okay, kia ora koutou everyone. My name's Eva Murray. I'm a principal analyst in the Commission's markets team, which is the team that focuses on emissions pricing. and particularly the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, which is what I'm going to be talking about today. Our draft advice does also look at the issue of pricing agricultural emissions, but that's as part of the agriculture section of the advice. So that's, I'll leave that to my colleagues when they do a webinar on that issue. So if we just go to the next slide, as we've just heard Chris outline, Aotearoa New Zealand's climate policies need to encourage both, gross emission reductions, decarbonisation, and forestry. Both of these things have an essential role to play in the low emissions transition. However, while we have the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme as a key tool for meeting emissions budgets and the 2050 target, unfortunately, it's not currently set up and structured in a way to deliver both of these things, both the gross reductions and carbon dioxide removals by forests. So in our draft advice, we identified two important issues as to why the NZ ETS is not best structured to deliver both of these things, which are just highlighted here. In the nearer term, that is over the next 10 years or so, and particularly over the period of the second emissions budget, the NZ ETS is likely to drive extensive afforestation rather than gross emissions reductions. But in the longer term, so if we look further out beyond the mid-2030s, the NZ ETS will also not provide the incentives for afforestation necessary to achieve net zero long-lived gas emissions by 2050. So if we think about that long-term net zero by 2050 target, we've potentially got an issue there. So I'm going to briefly explain the background to these issues in turn over the next few slides. Due to time, of course, this is going to be pretty high level, and there's certainly more information in Chapter 4 of our draft advice report. So do look to that for more information. Next slide, please. So on this first issue, the reason why the NZ ETS is likely to drive mostly afforestation rather than gross emission reductions in the near future, this is simply due to the economics of forestry and gross emission reductions. Forests can generate carbon dioxide removals at relatively low cost, in the range of around $25 to $50 per tonne. So that's relatively low cost. However, most gross emission reductions, so for example, in reducing emissions from process heat or in transport or industrial processes, the abatement opportunities are more expensive than that, with most opportunities for reducing emissions at source over $50 per tonne, and many of the important ones we have in New Zealand are above $100 a tonne. So the way the ETS currently works, it doesn't distinguish between these two types of ways of achieving our targets. So it will just drive the options that are the lowest cost from a financial perspective. And the design of the ETS and the way it operates doesn't take into account all the non-financial issues that are also important that Chris touched on in his presentation. So these are things like the equity considerations, the wider environmental issues that we need to pay attention to, as well as the different risks and benefits that come from gross emission reductions in forests. And there's benefits, with both, but we also need to make sure that we get both of these things. So this graph here is also just to sort of back up this point that the ETS is, the way it works currently is to drive whatever's financially cheapest, and actually that's, that's currently, planting forests. I mean, this graph here shows the way the planting of forests has really taken off in recent years, reaching more than in sort of around 60,000 hectares of new plantings last year. The evidence suggests that this is connected with the increase in the NZU price over recent years, as well as the shift to averaging accounting in the NZ ETS. So this increase is very significant, and it's certainly well above the amount of forest planting that the government factored in when it set emissions budgets. It factored in a planting rate of sort of on average 32,000 hectares a year over, from around now until 2030. So 60 or so thousand hectares in a year is kind of double that rate. So next slide, please. So the problem with this, sort of on the one hand, you could look at this and say, well, this is really great. We're overachieving. We're delivering more than we expected. Is this a good thing? And in some ways it is good. But the problem with this is that the way the ETS currently works, the more forests are planted and the more carbon dioxide that they remove from the atmosphere, the fewer gross emission reductions that NZ ETS will deliver. This is an inherent feature of its design. It's because it's just seeking to drive a certain amount of an abatement, and it doesn't care where that comes from. And the more more forestry abatement we get, the less gross emission reductions we'll get. And this is illustrated in this graph here, which shows a scenario. So this is a scenario. It's not exactly a forecast or a projection. It's just showing what would what we expect would happen if this 60,000 hectare per year planting rate continued into the future. And it shows how it could undermine the gross emission reductions that Aotearoa New Zealand could achieve over emissions budgets 1, 2, and 3, compared to the demonstration path and the government's sector sub-targets, which sort of were the basis on which our emissions budgets were set. So as you can see, there's, with the orange bars, that's quite a significantly lower amount of gross emission reductions. Next slide, please. And back to, initially I said we've identified 2 issues that really need to be looked at. Moving on to the second one, this is the issue that after the mid-2030s, the NZ ETS will not drive the planting of forests needed to achieve net zero by 2050. So while there's a very strong incentive for afforestation right now, looking beyond the mid-2030s, this incentive for afforestation will disappear. The reason, part of the reason for this is because not all long-lived gas emissions are covered by the NZ ETS. Sitting outside is a significant amount of nitrous oxide emissions generated by the agriculture sector. This means that there's not enough demand within the NZ ETS to drive all the removals by forests that Aotearoa will need to reach net zero long-lived gas emissions by 2050. So I'm going to take you through a couple of graphs here and build it up just to hopefully try and explain why this is the case. So this graph here shows a projection of the NZ ETS cap on emissions if we project that out into the future based on the current practice for setting this cap. This practice is that the cap on emissions in the ETS reflects the share of effort for NZ ETS sectors in terms of the abatement that those sectors are expected to deliver, reflecting the government's sector sub-targets. So in terms of what those sectors are, that's basically all of the sectors except for agriculture, so transport, power generation, industrial processes, waste, so emissions from municipal landfills and things like that. So this is how the cap is set. And as you can see, if we project this out into the future, it reaches 0 in 2037. This doesn't mean that the gross emissions from these sectors need to reach net zero by the state, or need to reach gross zero by the state. Just that their continuing emissions will need to be balanced by carbon dioxide removals by forests. And this is shown in the next version of this graph. Next slide. So building this up, what we've done here is overlaid the removals by forests needed to reach net zero by 2050. And this is across the whole of the economy. And so that's this sort of green band that's being laid over the blue area, which is the ETS cap. You can see here that there's a significant amount of removals needed that track below zero after 2037, if only emissions covered by the ETS are taken into account. So these are the removals needed to offset continued nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture, which aren't in the ETS. So given the ETS doesn't cover them, the ETS won't be able to drive these removals. So while this issue is only projected to arise in the mid-2030s, this is something that the government needs to start making a plan for over the next few years, and certainly in the second emissions budget period. And this is because the forward-looking nature of the carbon market and the long-term investment horizon of the forestry industry is that this issue will start to cause problems for incentivizing further forest planting well before 2037. The drop-off of incentives will be taken into account well before, the date that is shown in this map, and this graph. So it's important for the government to figure out an approach for how to deal with it before then, and how it will drive the further forest, removals, carbon dioxide removals by forests that will need to reach net zero. So this brings me to my last slide, which is about the proposed recommendations that we are consulting on. And this is focused on the changes that we see are needed so that emissions pricing, and particularly the NZ ETS, can support an equitable and sustainable low emissions transition. There are two parts to the draft recommendation relating to the two issues I've just gone over in turn. It also builds on the recommendation that Chris talked about earlier, about the government making clearer the contributions it is aiming for from both forests and from gross emissions reductions. So first, the first part is that we propose to recommend that the NZ ETS incentives for gross emission reductions are separated from those applying to forestry. And this would prevent removals by forests from undermining the gross emissions reductions we need over the next few years to make sure that the NZ ETS can indeed incentivize these gross reductions. And secondly, we recommend that an approach be developed to maintain incentives for afforestation past the mid-2030s, so that there are durable incentives in place to enable Aotearoa New Zealand to meet net zero by 2050. And finally, just to round this out, I'd like to emphasize that, I know these recommendations around making changes to the ETS, you might make some people quite nervous because it might seem like quite a lot of uncertainty, or more changes when the ETS has already had a number of changes over the past few years. But I'd just like to emphasize that the way any changes to the ETS are undertaken is very important. We've also, said this quite clearly in the advice, the draft advice. So the government will need to undertake careful analysis and thorough consultation. The ETS affects all of us, but it will be really critical for the government to understand the effects of any possible changes on the businesses directly participating in the scheme. And I'd also really stress that some iwi and Māori have a very significant stake in the New Zealand emissions trading scheme. So any government processes and decisions about amending the NZ ETS must recognise the rights of iwi and Māori and uphold Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. Applying the principles of partnership, protection and participation with iwi Māori will be crucial. So impacts for Māori collective landowners and iwi Māori foresters are understood and properly considered. And that's something we've tried to make really clear in the advice. So I'll now hand over to Ben, who'll talk about forests in a wider sense beyond just the emissions trading scheme.
Thank you, Eva. Kia ora tātou, ko Ben Aves tōku ingoa, hiuri tēnei no tūwhare toa no tūhoi. So I'm part of the land and waste team at the Commission, and I'll be specifically focusing on forests. So next slide, please. So here are some of the key messages that have come out of the forest chapter and outlines their importance. Forests are important for meeting long-lived gas targets through the removal and storage of carbon dioxide. However, an over-reliance on forests may enable Aotearoa New Zealand to meet its 2050 targets, but could make maintaining net zero emissions beyond 2050 difficult. Forests will also help us reach targets and budgets while providing wider benefits, particularly for adapting to climate change. As Chris mentioned earlier, these benefits include enhanced biodiversity, better air and water quality, and stabilisation of land to manage erosion. There are several threats to forestry that already exist, such as fire, storms and pests, which will be exacerbated by a changing climate, thus making significant reliance on carbon storage in forests relatively risky. Government should clarify the role of forestry that considers broader social, cultural, environmental and economic outcomes, including the bioeconomy, biodiversity, water quality, soil health and resiliency. Māori collectives need to be an integral part of the conversation to the role of forests going forward due to a unique connection within the forestry sector. This includes financial, cultural and spiritual connections. So once clear integrated objectives have been set, then the government should align policies underneath, such as ETS and RMA. There'll be some gaps which can only be filled by future policies, including issues like biodiversity. So looking at the recommendation, we propose that the emissions reduction plan for the second budget period must set and implement integrated objectives for the role of forests with respect to emissions mitigation and adaptation, while giving effect to the principles of Te Reti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. Kia ora. I'll pass it back to Chris.
Thanks, Ben. So just to wrap up, so what happens next from consultation? So once the consultation period is finished, the Commission will analyse and assess the feedback that we receive, and then be preparing final advice and recommendations to be given to government by the end of the year. It's then up to government to decide and set its second emissions reductions policy, and in order to meet the second budget period. So our consultation is live now, and so you can go to our website and see our consultation materials and to complete a submission. You can also kind of follow us on social media as well. So I really recommend reading our advice and, if possible, listening to some of the other webinars that we're going to be holding over the next couple of weeks. So you can hear a little bit more about the thinking behind our advice and ask more questions. So with that, I'll hand back to Sam to talk us and help us through the questions. Kia ora.
Kia ora, everyone. So we've received a few questions, so let's get straight to it. I'm going to start with a question for Eva on, we're going to start with a question for Eva on the ETS. This question is, assuming the ETS cap is auctions plus free allocation, how does the cap reaching zero in 2037 reconcile with industrial allocation expected to continue to 2050?
Hi, Sam. Thanks for that question. That question is actually something that we've highlighted in our draft advice. We haven't made a recommendation on it, but we do have a small section in Chapter 4 towards the end of that chapter that does highlight this issue, and that you know, the continuation of industrial allocation beyond 2037 is something that the government needs to think about, because if that did continue, what it would do, it would shift costs onto taxpayers. And you know, that's a decision that the government could take, that's appropriate to do that, but we think it needs to consider this, and that may not be an equitable approach to take. There is actually, the government is undertaking a reform process for industrial allocation right now. There's a bill being considered by select committee at the moment. So it will be really interesting to see what comes out of that process. They're proposing to update the allocative baselines. And there is also in the legislation at the moment, there is a process by which the rate of phase out of industrial allocation could be sped up over time, depending on some, analysis and advice that we might give in the future. So it's not 100% certain that that will actually occur, that there will still be industrial allocation past that point. But we think that it is an issue that the government needs to look at in terms of making sure the amount of industrial allocation being given out is appropriate, fit for purpose, that there isn't over allocation, and that we're not providing industrial allocation in a way that interferes too much with reducing emissions, because it probably wouldn't be a good outcome to be continuing to give industrial allocation past 2037.
Thanks, Eva. Now I've got a question probably for Ben, and I'll introduce Phil Wiles, who's another one of our forestry experts. So this question's from Janice at the University of Otago. What role does the Commission see for carbon sequestration from vegetation types and ecosystems other than forests? And connected to that question is a question about blue carbon as well. How would that fit into it?
Kia ora, Sam. So ko whau Wiles tāku inga. I'm a principal analyst in the land and waste team alongside Ben. Thanks for that question, Janice. It's a really good question, and we hear that a lot. We know that carbon is sequestered in a lot of other parts of our ecosystem, including in the ocean. There is a lot of ongoing research into how much carbon can be stored, how permanent storage of that carbon is, and the other thing that we need to look at is how we account for that carbon. So we need to make sure that if we are accounting for that carbon, we're doing that in an accurate and robust way, and that we're sure that that carbon will stay locked up out of the atmosphere. There are other vegetations which could be used to store carbon outside of forests. Again, there's ongoing research into looking at the robustness of how long that carbon is stored for and how we account for those. So an example of that is soil carbon. There's quite a lot of ongoing research into soil carbon.
Sure, thank you, Phil. But now turning back to the ETS and Eva, S. Godfrey asks, if forestry is treated separately going forward, would previous New Zealand units issued for forestry also be treated separately?
So this is a question that would have to be considered in the government process for looking at whether and how to change the ETS. I think that is an issue for the government to analyse and consult on and consider. Our advice is at the level, what we've been mandated to do is give the government advice on the direction of policy. So it's more at a strategic level. Hence we're highlighting, we see these issues with the ETS about how it may not be fit for purpose. It's really the job of the government, so that's ministers and the officials working in government ministries, to take that and do that detailed policy analysis around these sorts of issues about what would happen to the NZUs that already exist in the scheme. In our draft advice, we did outline some potential options for thinking about how the ETS could be changed. That was really to inform the debate. It's not really our role to kind of get into the very detailed operation of how the ETS works. So yeah, essentially this is a question that will need to be thought through in any further ETS amendment processes.
Kia ora, Eva. Now, got a question here for Chris from Matthew Gardner, referring to figure 3.2 of the report. Can we provide some detail on why forestry removals are modelled as declining sharply after 2055?
So unfortunately, I don't have that graph in front of me, but I can remember it. So I think that graph shows a scenario that we presented in our first piece of advice in 2021, which shows the effect of removals, a pathway to meeting net zero 2050, which relied heavily on removals from forestry. And what that showed is that you could achieve net zero through increasing removals, but then it was a scenario where we tested what happens if you stop planting in 2050. So it's not intended to represent, a pathway, but it's to show what the risks are. And what that shows is that you can get to net zero at 2050, and unless you continue to plant forestry beyond 2050, then net emissions essentially bounce back above zero again. And so that's the reason why those figures look like that, is because of the assumptions which underlie it. And I think we use that really just to illustrate the challenge, the challenges that would happen if we used a path to get to net zero, which just relied predominantly on removals from forestry to get us there. So more details of that will be found in Aotearoa New, so our first piece of advice, and there should be a footnote in the chapter which can direct you to the right part of that report to give you more detail about the assumptions that we used.
Thanks, Chris. So Eva and maybe Ben and Phil, if you'd like to chip in. Janice asks, if native afforestation in the permanent forestry category was mandated, would the slower growth rates help solve the issue created by the ETS?
So I would just point out that in the advice we see this issue of the potential for forests and carbon removals by forestry displacing gross emission reductions. We see that this is an issue that's not just restricted to permanent forestry. It's also an issue that needs to be thought about in terms of production forestry, because even if there's further restrictions put on permanent forestry, there's still a lot of land in New Zealand that could be converted to production forestry. So we're not, our advice around this is not focused or restricted to permanent forestry, and I just want to make that really clear. I think the question of what should happen with that permanent forest category, I mean, that really sort of speaks to the issues that Ben talked about around the forestry chapter of it would be really helpful for the government to kind of set out how it sees the roles of different types of forests, see what roles these different types of forests play in our long-term low emissions transition, because there's probably a role for, production, permanent, and, natives, and maybe also some permanent fast-growing trees as well. But that needs to be worked out, and there needs to be some level of consensus about that. Phil, do you want to comment any more on that, if I captured things there?
No, I think you got that pretty accurate, Eva, but just recapping what you said there, I think it's really important that the government thinks about the different roles that forest can play, and that's not just in terms of emissions removals, but also into the bioeconomy, how it might displace things like cement and steel, which are emissions intensive. There are opportunities there, but also the other benefits that it provides to things like biodiversity, and so some of those slower growing native forests can provide really significant biodiversity benefits where particularly in areas where we're set up in Tairāwhiti, where there's some quite erosion-prone land, there are some good opportunities out there. So we're just reiterating what you said, Eva. The government really needs to step back and think about what it wants to achieve with forests before setting policies underneath.
Thanks. So got a question here from Manu Caddy. Is there a risk that forestry investors who lease land, especially Maori land, take the income from the New Zealand units in the short to medium term, and then leave landowners with largely worthless, stranded assets that locks land into permanent pine plantations, especially as there's no evidence they can easily be transitioned to diverse native forests? Maybe Ben or Eva would like to take that one?
Or Phil?
Phil?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it. I think it's the same as the end of Eva's answer earlier on. So that's a really good question, Manu. And I think making sure that we, as a country, we think about how we want to use forests and where we might want to use these these permanent forests, and what that might mean in the long term for people who might have stranded assets and don't have the NZUs in their possession anymore. We need to think about how we design policies to, in a more broader sense, how we come up with good outcomes for the country in the long term.
And potentially also what sort of work needs to be done alongside the ETS to make sure that people have the information to make good decisions and to understand what they might be getting into when they, plant a forest and register it in the ETS. I have heard some feedback from stakeholders that this information hasn't always been obvious or clear to them, and maybe there's a role for government there in supporting people with better training or information or tools to help people understand what the implications of getting involved in the ETS are.
From Matthew Gardner for Eva, don't a significant proportion of removals from plantation forests need to be held back by foresters to meet their future harvest obligations?
This is comes to an issue which is a little bit tricky to understand, but I'll have a go. I think there's something that perhaps a lot of people aren't really very aware of, is that the way we account for our targets at a national level and the way the carbon accounting for forests in the NZ ETS, the way those two systems are not exactly the same and they don't completely align. We account for the carbon dioxide removals by forests in the way we track towards our national targets. But in the ETS, what happens is that the government gives units to forests registered in the ETS that to reflect the carbon dioxide removals. So the slightly complex issue and situation we have at the moment in both our target accounting and in the ETS is that in 2021 the country changed its accounting approach for its targets. So in the past, for our targets, we used something called stock change accounting. And from 2021, we're moving towards something called averaging. So in the past, the ETS, which was designed to mirror our target accounting approach, used stock change accounting for forests. So this is what Matthew's referring to. Under this approach in the ETS, foresters receive NZUs for the full carbon stock that of the growth of their forest, but then when they harvest their forest, they have to return a large amount of those units back to the government. However, from now on, the ETS is also changing to averaging. Although the forests that are still on stock change will still be able to use the stock change method, but from now on, this averaging accounting approach, which applies to our target and to our forests registered in the ETS from now on, these forests will only earn credits or units in the ETS up to what is expected to be their long-term average carbon stock over multiple rotations, and there's no surrender liability on harvest. So sorry, it's probably a bit complicated and confusing, but what I would say is that from now on, foresters won't have harvest liabilities, and if they're on the averaging accounting approach, they won't have to return units to the government. The forests that are still on stock change accounting in the ETS, they will have to do that, but those units, particularly if they're units from pre-2021, they don't actually represent removals that are counted in our targets anyway, because those removals were generated before our target period starts. Yeah, maybe if you want more information on this, you could email us, because I know that's probably quite a complicated issue.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eva, for explaining what is a complicated issue quite well. So we've got a question here from Manu Caddy, maybe Ben or Phil. When the New Zealand unit price, and just for those who aren't ETS experts, the New Zealand units are what's created by the ETS and what is traded in the ETS and often shortened to NZU. was $20. Forestry companies said they wouldn't focus on natives because they needed $40 to make natives work. Since then, it's been double that price, but we're still told natives aren't feasible. So can the ETS incentivise native forest planting?
Yeah, that's a very good question. When you look at carbon sequestration by different species, then exotic species like pine are always going to grow faster than most of our native species, and so they'll always return a higher return when you put them into the ETS and earn NZUs. So the ETS it does incentivise some planting of native forest, but it's always going to in most cases it will incentivise fast-growing forests like pines. So there is probably going to be a need for a suite of different policies alongside the ETS to help incentivise establishment of native forests. Now, how that's done is something that requires quite a bit of policy work, and is probably as well something we're recommending that that the government should do. In fact, that's something we recommended in Untitled Chapter in our last set of emissions reductions advice, and the government has done some work on that, but we're still looking to see where that goes.
I guess, Phil, to follow on that, the native forestry component lacks clear financial return, which makes it hard to justify the commercial planting. So the government's indicating the first emissions reduction plan that they're looking to reduce the cost of planting natives, and this is through ideas such as reducing the cost for seedlings and stuff like that.
Kia ora, team. Probably got time for a couple more. Just to turn back to the chat we had about other types of vegetation and blue carbon and soil carbon, are removals that do not fit into the ETS still being considered in the emissions reduction plan? Or our advice on the emissions reduction plan, to be more accurate?
I can probably make some comments around this. The situation is at the moment is that the way emissions budgets, as well as our nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, the way the accounting for these targets has been defined, which is based on the way New Zealand accounted for its targets previously under the Kyoto Protocol, is that the only sort of nature-based removals or solutions that actually count towards these targets are forests. So, and the way a forest is defined under the accounting rules, which is an area of at least 1 hectare and 30% canopy cover, and there's some other criteria as well. So, so that is why our advice is quite focused when we're thinking about sequestration, why it's very focused on forests, because those are the removals that count towards targets. However, I would draw your attention to the fact that when we gave advice on the setting of emissions budgets and Anaya Tonune advice in 2021, we recommended that the government look at expanding the accounting methodologies for our targets, and particularly with a greater range of land categories and activities could be included, including things like peatlands and vegetation, vegetation that doesn't meet the criteria to be considered a forest. So really where this issue of other types of removals, where that has to be considered is when the accounting rules for emissions budgets are set. The government did consider those, and we've still got the same accounting approaches before, but the government has said that it's going to do further work to expand the accounting. It's just it hasn't actually taken that very far yet. So that's why we're focusing on the things that we're focusing on, because we have to pay attention to those accounting rules.
Cool, thank you, Eva. And then probably our final question for today, so I've only got a few minutes left. Is there potential for Scope 3 emissions reporting? Scope 3 emissions are those in a company's supply chain to drive decarbonisation in the New Zealand economy in parallel to participants' New Zealand units' cost of meeting their ETS surrender obligations. Eva or Chris, maybe? I
can say something if
Yeah,
you don't want to. So, I mean, I think, you know, we think that if companies are focusing on reducing Scope 3 emissions, that's fantastic and that's great. And that's also, you know, if companies are doing that, that's a good thing. And also that's becoming a trend internationally. So, if, you know, if our companies want to stay competitive and keep up with what's going on in the international sphere, that's also, you know, a good thing to do. I would point out that one company's Scope 3 emissions is someone else's Scope 1 emissions. So if those emissions are within the boundary of New Zealand, you know, if they are reduced, that, you know, that contributes to our targets, and that's great. Yeah, I don't think it really changes the sort of issues we've identified around the ETS. It just means that, you know, we could get some more reductions in emissions than we might anticipate. But the way the ETS works, it's like a self-balancing system. So, for example, if there's reductions that come through Scope 3 emissions, that doesn't change it doesn't mean that we'll be overachieving. The ETS is set up to deliver a certain amount of emissions, and that's what it will target. So yeah, it could allow some other greater emissions somewhere else in the economy, unless it's corrected for in some way, which there is a bit of scope to do that in the way the cap is set in the ETS because it's flexible. But yeah, any further comments, Chris?
No, I think that was very, very comprehensive. Thank you, Eva.
Yeah, I guess I would say there's not a whole lot of evidence available to us about exactly what these companies are doing and the scale of what those emissions reductions might be, which is, you know, it's not something that we're able to really analyze because of limited data. But we'd be really interested in any data on this that anybody could share with us.
And that's a really good link to wrapping it up. In particular, reminding people to go to our website and make a submission. Submissions are online anytime before the 20th of June at haveyoursay.climatecommission.govt.nz, and there'll be a link through our socials and on our main website as well. So I'm sure it's just a quick Google away if you didn't quite note all of that website down. So I'd just like to finish off by thanking the presenters very much. Really appreciate all your hard work and all the answers to the participants' questions. Thank you very much for people who come to attend the webinar. Really appreciate your attendance and participation. I'd now like to hand over to Bevan to finish us off with a closing karakia.
Tēnā koutou mua koutou whai wāhi I tēnei rā, anei te karakia whakamutunga. Ka hiki te tapu, kia wā tea ai te ara, kia tūru ki ai te ao marama. Haumi e hui e tai ki e. Just for the translation, restrictions are removed aside, so the pathway is clear to return to everyday activities, enriched and unified. Tēnā tātou.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Kia ora.